He was just an ordinary 13-year-old boy, riding home from school on a route he'd taken 100 times before. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and the sky was painted in soft orange and violet. His headphones were in, a song he loved was playing, and there was nothing out of the ordinary until there was. In a split second, everything changed. A screech of tires, a sharp blast of sound, then silence. His body was thrown into the air like a rag doll. Time seemed to slow as he felt himself lift off the ground, his thoughts still trying to catch up with what was happening. And then blackness, no pain, no sound, just nothing. That's when it all began. He says he didn't realize he had died. It didn't feel like death. It didn't even feel like sleep. It was like being pulled gently through a tunnel that shimmered like light on water, but the air felt still, and the silence was almost sacred. He felt no fear, no confusion, just a deep, unshakable calm. And then the tunnel widened, and he found himself standing on what looked like a vast, endless field. The grass shimmered with gold and silver, and a light, brighter than the sun but not blinding, poured down from a sky without a sun. He knew, without being told, that he was no longer in the world he knew. That's when he noticed the presence. It wasn't footsteps or a shadow. He just knew someone had arrived. The light around him seemed to respond to it, growing warmer, gentler. He turned, and there before him stood a figure robed in white, radiant, yet unmistakably human. A presence so powerful it brought him to his knees without a word being spoken. But it wasn't fear that overwhelmed him, it was love. A love so deep it felt like it could split his chest open. The boy couldn't speak, couldn't even think straight, and then the figure spoke. "My child," the voice said, not with lips but directly into his mind and heart at once. "Do not be afraid. I am Jesus." The boy says the moment he heard the name, he felt like everything inside him exploded, like a million truths rushed into his body all at once. Jesus stood before him, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as a real living being. And with eyes that seemed to see through time and space, Jesus looked at him and said words he will never forget. "There is a message I must send, and I have chosen you." The boy didn't know what to think. Why him? Why now? But even as he struggled to understand what was happening, Jesus began to speak again, and the name that came next sent chills down the boy's spine, even in that perfect, peaceful place. "Caroline, leave it," Jesus said. "You must warn them. She is in danger." The boy froze. He didn't know who that was. Caroline Levitt. The name meant nothing to him. Yet when Jesus said it, it echoed inside his mind like a bell struck in a cathedral. It reverberated with a strange weight, as if reality itself had shifted around it. He wanted to ask who she was, why it mattered, what the danger was, but his voice was locked inside him. He felt like a thread in a vast tapestry that had just been tugged, and suddenly the whole design had changed. Jesus didn't wait for the boy's confusion to settle. "You must understand," he said, "what happens in the world now has consequences far greater than most realize. The time is urgent. The battles you see are not just political, they are spiritual." The boy, still overwhelmed by the presence and the light and the truth that seemed to pulse in the air itself, could do nothing but listen. Jesus continued, speaking with a tone both calm and commanding. "Caroline has been chosen for a path that will bring her into direct confrontation with forces that wish to silence truth. She speaks not only with her voice but with the authority of her conviction, and that makes her dangerous to those who serve the lie." The words hung in the air like thunder without a storm. The boy didn't know what to do with them. Who was this woman and what was her role? Why her, out of the millions who speak about politics or faith? But as Jesus continued, the pieces began to fall into place. The boy was shown visions, not like on a screen, but more like knowledge being downloaded directly into his soul. He saw a young woman poised behind a podium facing a sea of cameras and flashing lights. He saw her words being twisted, her faith mocked, her mission ridiculed, but still she stood. Still she spoke. Still she prayed. He was being shown a real person, a living person, someone alive right now in his world, and she was in danger. As the images faded, Jesus spoke again. She will not fall because of her own weakness, but because those in the shadows are plotting. They do not attack with swords, but with lies, with influence, with fear, and there are few who are truly awake to what is coming. The boy finally managed to whisper, "Why are you telling me?" Jesus looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold all of history and said, "Because children still hear my voice even when the world no longer listens. You must be the voice that breaks through the noise." The boy returned, shaken but filled with a burning urgency. He couldn't forget the name, Caroline Levitt. When he finally awoke days later in the hospital, after doctors called it a miracle he survived at all, the name still rang in his mind. He started to look her up, and what he found shocked him. She was real, not just real, but powerful. A political advisor, then press secretary, then, now, serving under Donald Trump during one of the most divided eras in American politics. Not just a politician, but a woman of faith, known for being bold, unapologetic, and unafraid to say what she believed. He found clips of her speaking confidently on national television, handling journalists' questions with fire and control far beyond her years. She was only in her late 20s, but already being called the future of the conservative movement. She had once been the youngest woman to ever serve as a White House press secretary, and her rise had only intensified as Trump's 2024 campaign evolved into something larger than anyone had predicted. Now, with Trump in office again and Levitt by his side, she had become one of the most visible and controversial figures in the administration, and that made her a target. The boy dug deeper. He began to see what Jesus meant. Social media feeds flooded with attacks on her character. Headlines accusing her of extremism simply for quoting scripture. Former colleagues turning their backs. Anonymous threats. Political enemies painting her as a villain simply for refusing to compromise. But behind all of that, something darker was lurking. Something organized. And now, because of what he'd been shown, the boy was certain it wasn't just politics. It was something deeper, something spiritual, something most people would never see coming. The boy couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the same warning echoed in his mind. She is in danger. He remembered how Jesus had said it, not in fear, not in panic, but with certainty. It wasn't just a vague threat or symbolic danger. It was immediate, real, specific. And as he scrolled endlessly through articles, interviews, and comment threads, he began to see the pattern. Caroline Levitt wasn't just disliked by political opponents. She was being systematically targeted. There was something cold and calculating about the way attacks were being launched. Not just personal insults, but deliberate efforts to discredit her, isolate her, and frame her as a threat to the very democracy she was working within. and as he read, the boy began to remember more of what he had seen during his experience, visions that had been so overwhelming at the time he hadn't fully processed them. Now they came into focus. One vision showed Caroline standing at a podium, surrounded by flashing cameras, her face calm but her eyes tired. Then came a shadow, moving through the crowd, indistinct, faceless, but full of hatred. Not the hatred of political rivalry, but the kind that comes from a deeper place, a hatred of truth, of conviction, of light. In another image, she was alone in a room, her phone lighting up with threats disguised as warnings, her staff growing nervous, even some turning on her quietly. There were people around her who smiled in public but whispered betrayal in private. And all the while the boy heard Jesus' voice in the background of these visions. They will not strike her with open hands but with hidden daggers. She will stand, but not without scars. That phrase repeated over and over, not without scars. It made him realize this wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about red versus blue, or policy debates, or partisan talking points. This was about something deeper, something spiritual. Caroline Levitt had become a symbol of what happens when someone speaks boldly in a world that wants silence, when someone stands for faith in a culture that rewards compromise. The boy felt it like fire in his chest. The threat wasn't just media smear campaigns or angry mobs online. It was something older, something darker, a spiritual force that hated what she stood for, because what she stood for was light. And yet, even in the middle of the chaos, there were signs, small, almost hidden, that she was being protected. During one of her most intense press conferences, where reporters bombarded her with accusations, she suddenly paused and quoted scripture, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" The boy had watched that clip over and over. He had no doubt she was speaking not just to the reporters, but to the darkness itself. And that's when he remembered something else Jesus had told him. "She is strong, but she is not alone. My hand is on her, but so is theirs. You must be the voice that awakens the others." The boy didn't know who the others were, but he started to believe that maybe it meant people like him, ordinary people, people who could pray, people who could speak, people who hadn't given up hope. Because if Caroline was in danger for standing up, then the real question wasn't just what was coming for her, but what would happen if she fell. If someone like her was taken down, silenced, or destroyed, it wouldn't just be a personal loss. It would send a message to everyone else watching. Don't stand up, don't speak, don't believe. That, the boy realized, was the real goal. Not just to stop Caroline, but to make her fall so loudly that others would never dare follow her path. And that's why Jesus had spoken to him, not to scare him, not to make him famous, but to warn, to awaken, to prepare, because something was moving, and it was closer than anyone realized. He couldn't stop thinking about what Jesus had said. She will not fall because of her own weakness, but because those in the shadows are plotting. That line haunted him. It wasn't about her making a mistake or being reckless. It wasn't about her failing in public. It was about something happening behind the scenes, deliberate, calculated. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the darkness Jesus spoke of wasn't just spiritual metaphor. It was real people, real systems, real institutions that didn't just oppose Caroline Levitt's ideas, they feared them, and that fear had turned to hostility. But here's what stood out even more than the threat. the way Jesus had described her. He hadn't spoken about her like a politician. He hadn't even called her a leader. He'd called her chosen. There was a sacredness to that word, a weight. And now the boy felt it too. He began to pray, at first in silence, unsure of what to say. But the more he spoke, the more the fire inside him grew. It wasn't his words. It wasn't even his strength. It was something flowing through him. He understood what Jesus meant when he said children still hear his voice. His innocence wasn't weakness. It was a doorway. And now he felt responsible. Not in a burdened, anxious way, but with urgency. The kind of urgency you feel when you see someone standing alone in a storm and realize you're holding the umbrella. The boy's parents didn't understand what was happening to him. Neither did his friends. He stopped playing games. He stopped talking about sports. All he wanted to do was learn about Carolyn, about her faith, her journey, and why the world was trying so hard to break her down. He started following everything she said, listening closely, not just to the content, but to the tone. And what he noticed gave him chills. There were moments, barely noticeable, where her voice would catch, where her confidence flickered, not from fear but from weariness, like someone fighting on the front lines with no one guarding her back. That's when he knew what his mission truly was. Not to save her physically, not to shield her from every attack, but to rally others, to awaken people who could pray for her, support her, protect her with something stronger than policy or politics, with faith. He posted his first video online. It wasn't polished, it wasn't long. It was just him sitting in a room saying, "I died, I saw Jesus, and he gave me a message. Caroline Levitt is in danger and we need to cover her in prayer." It exploded almost overnight. Some mocked him, some accused him of making it up, but others listened. People who'd never prayed before started reaching out. Pastors began mentioning Caroline's name in church services. Prayer groups formed. Emails flooded her staff. Something had been triggered, and the boy knew it wasn't because of him. It was because the message was real. It had power, and it came from the highest authority there is. Then came the moment he'd been both dreading and hoping for. He woke up one night, days after his video went viral, with a deep pressure in his chest. Not pain, but presence. He sat up in bed, and there, standing at the foot of it, was light. Not like before, not the full glory he had seen in his near-death moment, but a taste of it, a whisper of it, and a voice that wasn't heard with ears. "Now speak louder," it said. "She must hear you." And in that moment, he knew what to do. It wasn't enough to pray in silence. It wasn't enough to tell his friends. He needed to reach her directly. The next morning he dictated a letter. A strange calm washed over him as he wrote, even though the words didn't come from his mind. They poured through his hand. He told her everything, the visions, the warning, the danger. But more than that, he told her she was not alone, that she was surrounded by prayers, shielded by faith, chosen not for ease but for purpose. He didn't know if she'd ever read it. He didn't care. All he knew was that the message had to get out. And when he finished, he looked at the envelope in his hands and knew something had changed. The mission had only just begun. He hadn't just been sent back to warn. He'd been sent back to ignite something. A movement, a defense. A shield not made of stone or steel, but of people awakened to something far bigger than politics, something eternal, something sacred, and now that it had begun, there would be no stopping it. The letter was sent. No address but the official one, no connections to guarantee it would even land on her desk, but the boy knew it didn't matter. What he had written would reach her one way or another. Whether by mail or miracle, the message was on its way, and once it was out of his hands, something strange happened. The boy felt lighter, as if the burden of the vision he had carried since his return had shifted. Not disappeared, never that, but changed. It was no longer his to guard alone. It had been released into the world, and now others had picked it up. People were talking. Strangers from across the country were messaging him, thanking him for being brave enough to share his experience. A man from Ohio told him his small church had started praying for Caroline by name during every service. A mother from Texas said her son, once rebellious and angry, had asked her if God still spoke to people after watching the boy's video. A retired veteran in Florida said he hadn't prayed in 20 years, but something about the way the boy said Jesus cracked open a part of him he thought had long died. These were ripples, and the boy could feel them turning into waves. But what startled him most were the people who didn't believe at first, those who mocked, who called it a stunt, who dismissed it as delusion, only to return days later saying they couldn't shake the story. Something about it stayed with them, gnawed at them, made them curious. That curiosity was beginning to look like awakening. The boy knew this wasn't about him. That was the whole point. It had never been. It was about something bigger moving beneath the surface, something that was only now starting to rise. It was about a war between silence and truth, between fear and conviction, and the message was a spark. And now that spark had caught fire. Then, just when he thought the story might be slowing down, a message came. Not an email, not a viral comment, but a physical envelope, delivered to his front door without postage. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "I received your letter. I believe you. I have felt the pressure you described. I'm not afraid, but I'm grateful to know I am not standing alone." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The handwriting was small, neat, and unmistakably intentional. And attached to the letter was a single verse written in ink so dark it bled slightly through the paper. Isaiah 41:10. "Do not fear, for I am with you." The boy's hands trembled. The message had reached her. But that wasn't the end. That was the beginning of something much, much bigger. The dreams began again. Not like before, not visions of golden fields and shimmering skies, but dreams of the world as it was now. Cities and screens, voices arguing, protests, news cycles spinning out of control. But in the middle of it all, he kept seeing Caroline standing, always standing, even when others fell. Even when voices screamed in her face, even when hands reached to pull her down, and behind her, now clearly visible, were more people, praying, watching, guarding. The movement was growing. The boy started posting more, but this time not about politics, not even about Caroline directly. He spoke about courage, about truth, about listening to the voice that still speaks if you're willing to hear it. About standing when it would be easier to kneel to comfort or fear. And people listened. They weren't coming for drama anymore. They were coming for clarity, for direction, for answers. And through him, somehow, they were finding them. He didn't pretend to be a prophet. He didn't claim to have all the answers. He just kept pointing back to the moment everything changed, when he died, and Jesus told him to speak. And now he's speaking louder than ever. But the most powerful part wasn't what he said next. It was what he hinted at. Because the visions weren't finished, the warnings hadn't stopped. There were more names, more faces, more turning points on the way. Carolyn was only the first domino, the first front line, and now that the message had gone out, others would rise, others would hear, others would step into the spotlight not to be admired, but to be tested. The boy ended his next video with just a few chilling, electrifying words. "You've heard what happened to me. You know what I saw. You know who's been warned. But this isn't over. There's more coming. And I have to tell you what's next. Because something's coming for all of us. Not just one woman, not just one movement. It's already here. And if you're listening, you've already been chosen." And with that, the message spread again. Faster, louder, unstoppable. The fire had been lit, and the war had begun.